The ARIA Tech Summit was supposed to be a celebration of brilliance, a convergence of innovation, leadership, and groundbreaking ideas. For Camille Ross, a brilliant inventor and entrepreneur in her early 30s, it was more than an event. It was validation. Years of sleepless nights in her cluttered studio had finally paid off. Her eco-tech startup, GreensPark, was now at the forefront of renewable energy solutions. She had fought for a chance to present her innovations to the industry's most influential leaders. This summit was her moment to shine. Camille adjusted her blazer, the deep green fabric mirroring her company's brand, as she stepped into the glittering conference hall. Around her, polished executives and investors mingled under the soft glow of chandeliers. The air buzzed with ambition, but as Camille approached the check-in desk, her excitement dimmed. The clerk, a young man in a crisp white shirt, looked up briefly. His smile faltered when his eyes met hers, lingering for a moment before shifting to her colleague, Nate, who stood at her side. "Welcome to the summit," the clerk said, his tone professional but distant. "Nate." "Camille Ross," she replied, her voice steady. Her name should have been enough. She was one of the keynote speakers, after all. The clerk typed her name into his tablet, his expression stiffening. "I'm sorry, but I don't see your name on the list." Camille's stomach dropped. She glanced at Nate, who immediately leaned in. "There must be a mistake," Nate said, his voice calm but firm. "She's the founder of GreensPark. You sent her the invitation personally." The clerk hesitated, the edges of his professionalism cracking. "One moment," he muttered, picking up a phone and murmuring into it. Camille exhaled slowly, willing herself to stay composed. It wasn't the first time her credentials had been questioned. She had grown used to proving herself in rooms where her skin tone and gender made her an outlier. Minutes dragged on before a tall woman in a sleek gray suit approached, her smile rehearsed but brittle. "Ms. Ross," she said, "I'm Lydia from the summit's organizing committee. There seems to have been a mix-up, but we'll—" Camille raised a hand, cutting her off. "I don't need excuses, Lydia," she said, her voice calm but laced with steel. "I need to know if I'm presenting or not." Lydia's smile wavered. "Of course," she said. "Let me ensure everything is sorted." As Lydia hurried off, Nate turned to Camille, his brow furrowed. "This isn't right," he said. "We confirmed everything weeks ago." Camille straightened her shoulders, her determination hardening. "It doesn't matter," she said. "If they won't give me the stage, I'll find another way to make them hear me." This wasn't just about GreensPark anymore. It was about taking up space, spaces that weren't designed for people like her. If the summit wasn't ready for Camille Ross, then it was about to learn who she was the hard way. The city of Brighton Falls hummed with life as the morning sun kissed its skyline. A place of stark contrasts. It was where old brick buildings with cracked facades stood alongside sleek glass towers, where ambition and tradition collided daily. At the heart of it all was Dr. Olivia Langston, a name synonymous with breakthroughs in neuroscience and philanthropy. But if anyone were to glance at her now, sitting in a modest corner booth of Marlene's Diner, they might mistake her for just another patron. The aroma of fresh coffee and sizzling bacon wafted through the air as Olivia folded her hands around a chipped ceramic mug. She loved this place, the unpolished charm, the warmth of Marlene's smile when she called her sweetheart, and the unapologetically greasy hash browns that reminded her of simpler days. "Morning, Dr. Langston," Marlene greeted, balancing a tray of steaming plates. Her tone carried the respect of someone who knew Olivia's story, yet she spoke with the familiarity of a neighbor. That's how Olivia preferred it. No pretense. No fanfare. "Morning, Marlene," Olivia replied, her voice smooth yet unassuming. She had learned long ago that humility was armor in a world that often mistook confidence for arrogance, especially from someone like her. A black woman who had climbed the ranks of academia, medicine, and business with quiet resolve. Her tailored navy blue blazer, worn over a crisp white blouse, was a subtle nod to the authority she wielded as the CEO of Langston Medical Innovations, a company revolutionizing brain trauma treatment. But here, she let her polished image fade into the diner's tapestry of plaid-shirted regulars and construction workers in high-visibility vests. As she skimmed the local paper, Olivia caught snippets of a lively debate at the counter. Two men were arguing over the mayor's recent proposal for affordable housing reforms. "Look, all I'm saying," the younger man began, gesturing with a fork loaded with scrambled eggs, "is that these policies sound nice on paper, but where's the accountability? Who's footing the bill?" The older man, who looked like he'd seen a few Brighton Falls winters too many, scowled. "You don't get it. Folks are struggling. You can't build a thriving city on the backs of people you keep pushing out." Olivia smiled faintly. The debate mirrored her own internal battles. She had spent her life fighting to balance compassion with innovation, equity with ambition. It wasn't always easy, especially in a society that often questioned her right to the space she occupied. Just then, the sound of the bell above the door drew Olivia's attention. A group of women walked in, their laughter echoing as they made their way to a booth. Among them was Evelyn Grayson, the chairwoman of a major investment firm Olivia had been courting for months. Evelyn's influence could unlock funding for Olivia's newest venture, a line of affordable neurodiagnostic tools for underserved clinics. But Evelyn had yet to commit, and today's meeting was Olivia's opportunity to sway her. Evelyn caught Olivia's eye and waved. Her tailored cream suit and pearl necklace radiated wealth and power, but her smile was warm, almost disarming. "Dr. Langston," she said, approaching the table. "Fancy seeing you here. I hope we're not intruding." "Not at all," Olivia replied, rising to shake her hand. "Marlene's is Brighton Falls' best-kept secret." "Charming," Evelyn said, though her tone suggested she found the diner quaint at best. She gestured toward her group. "We'll leave you to your paper, but perhaps we could chat later?" "Of course," Olivia said, her mind already anticipating the strategic points she would need to hit during their conversation. As Evelyn returned to her table, Olivia noticed the subtle glances exchanged among her companions. It was nothing overt, just the faintest flicker of doubt, curiosity, or perhaps judgment. She'd seen it before, in boardrooms and fundraisers, where her presence often felt more scrutinized than celebrated. But she let it roll off her, as she always did. Her thoughts were interrupted by a commotion near the cash register. A young cashier, barely out of high school, was nervously trying to manage an irate customer, a man in a tailored suit who looked wildly out of place in the diner. "I don't care about your policy," the man snapped, waving a gold credit card in the air. "I need this handled now." "I'm really sorry, sir," the cashier stammered, her voice trembling. "It's just that the system—" "Unbelievable," the man interrupted, turning to the room as if seeking validation for his outrage. His eyes landed on Olivia, and for a brief moment, he seemed to consider her part of the problem, not the solution. Without hesitation, Olivia rose from her seat. "Is there a problem here?" she asked, her voice calm, but carrying an edge of authority that silenced the man's tirade. He turned to her, clearly unimpressed. "I'm having an issue with my payment, and this girl doesn't seem to know how to handle it." Olivia glanced at the cashier, who looked on the verge of tears. "It sounds like a technical glitch," she said. "I'm sure it can be resolved without raising your voice." The man bristled, clearly unaccustomed to being challenged. "And you are?" "Dr. Olivia Langston," she said evenly, her gaze steady. "And you?" His confidence faltered for a split second, but he recovered quickly. "Michael Reardon, Senior VP at Lexer International." Olivia nodded, unimpressed. "Well, Mr. Reardon, I suggest you treat service workers with the same respect you'd expect in your office. Now, why don't we step aside and let the cashier do her job?" Reardon looked like he wanted to argue, but the weight of Olivia's presence and the quiet attention of the diner's patrons rendered him speechless. With a muttered apology to the cashier, he stepped aside, retreating to a corner booth where he glowered into his phone. The cashier murmured her thanks, her voice barely audible. Olivia smiled gently. "You're doing fine. Don't let people like that ruin your day." As Olivia returned to her seat, she noticed Evelyn watching from across the room. Their eyes met briefly, and Evelyn gave a small nod, her expression unreadable. Olivia couldn't help but wonder what Evelyn had gleaned from the exchange. Back at her table, Olivia picked up her coffee, letting the warmth of the mug ground her. Moments like these were a reminder of the battles she fought daily, some small, like silencing a bully in a diner, and others monumental, like securing funding to save lives. But Olivia had never been one to back down. She didn't just occupy spaces where she wasn't wanted. She transformed them. The bell above the door jingled again, and Olivia glanced up. A reporter from the Brighton Herald had just entered, her notebook already open. The journalist had been following Olivia's career closely, and Olivia suspected today's visit to the diner might feature in the next article. Olivia allowed herself a small smile. Let them write. Let them watch. The story she was writing for herself was far more compelling. Continue from the opening scene and write the next 1,500 words, focusing on the development of the initial conflict between the protagonist and the individuals or system they encounter. Focus areas for this section. Highlight prejudice and biases. Show how the supporting characters, e.g., police officers, store managers, judges, or other authority figures, underestimate or mistreat the protagonist based on racial biases or assumptions about their appearance. Use both subtle microaggressions and overt acts of discrimination to escalate tension. Protagonist reaction. Showcase how the protagonist remains calm and professional, despite the growing injustice. Highlight their internal struggle between anger and maintaining composure. Build the tension. Gradually escalate the conflict, creating a sense of frustration and helplessness for the protagonist while making the audience empathize deeply with their plight. Tone and pacing. Keep the narrative engaging and realistic, balancing vivid descriptions of the events with emotional insight into the protagonist's experience. Instructions. Write this section to establish the stakes and deepen the audience's connection with the protagonist. Build anticipation for a major turning point in the next section. When finished, confirm readiness to proceed to prompt 4 for the pivotal moment of the story. The murmur of conversation in Marlene's diner had picked up again, but the air remained thick with unease. Dr. Olivia Langston sat in her booth, her back straight and her expression composed, but a tempest brewed beneath her calm exterior. The events of the past hour had taken a toll, not because they were new, but because they were exhausting in their familiarity. Her thoughts were interrupted by a sudden movement at the door. Officer Danley entered again, followed by a third man in plain clothes, his badge visible on his belt. This man carried himself with an air of authority, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on Olivia. He approached her booth with measured steps, his expression unreadable. "Dr. Langston?" he said, his tone sharp but polite. Olivia looked up, meeting his gaze without flinching. "Yes, I'm Lieutenant Harris," he said, his voice steady but tinged with something darker. "I'd like to ask you a few questions outside." The diner grew quiet again, the tension palpable. Marlene paused mid-step, a plate of pancakes in her hand, her mouth opening as if to object. Evelyn Grayson and her companions exchanged uncertain glances, their earlier lightheartedness replaced with a sense of unease. Olivia rose slowly, taking a moment to adjust her blazer. "I've already spoken to your officers, Lieutenant," she said evenly. "Is there a reason we need to revisit the issue?" Harris didn't blink. "We've received additional information. It won't take long." Olivia hesitated, her instincts flaring. This was no longer a matter of misunderstanding. It was something more insidious. Still, she nodded, unwilling to create a scene she couldn't control. Outside, the crisp air bit at her skin as she stood on the sidewalk, facing Harris and Danley. Officer Reyes lingered by the patrol car, his expression conflicted. "Dr. Langston," Harris began, crossing his arms. "We've reviewed the statements provided by Mr. Reardon and a few other witnesses. Based on their accounts, we have reason to believe your actions were threatening." Olivia's jaw tightened. "Threatening?" she repeated, incredulous. "I spoke firmly to someone who was harassing a young employee. That's not a threat. It's called accountability." Harris's eyes narrowed. "Witnesses claim you raised your voice and made aggressive gestures. That's enough to warrant concern." "Concern for whom?" Olivia countered, her voice steady but edged with steel. "The man shouting at a cashier? Or the black woman who dared to intervene?" Danley shifted uncomfortably, but Harris didn't waver. "Dr. Langston, I'm going to ask you to come with us to the station for further questioning." The words hit like a blow. Olivia's pulse quickened, but she refused to let her composure crack. Am I under arrest, Lieutenant? Not at this time, Harris replied, his tone cool. But if you refuse to cooperate, then what? She interrupted, her voice rising ever so slightly. You'll escalate this farce further? You'll arrest me in broad daylight in front of witnesses for doing nothing wrong. The door of the diner swung open, and Marlene stepped out, her face flushed with anger. Now hold on just a minute, she said, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. This woman hasn't done a damn thing wrong, and you know it. Marlene, Olivia said gently, raising a hand to calm her. It's fine. No, it's not. Marlene snapped, her eyes blazing as she turned to Harris. You've got the wrong person, Lieutenant. That man, she pointed through the window at Reardon, still sulking in his booth, is the one who caused trouble. Dr. Langston was the only one who stood up for my girl. And now you want to drag her off like she's some kind of criminal? Harris's expression hardened. Ma'am, I suggest you step back. No, Marlene said firmly, planting herself beside Olivia. I won't step back. Not this time. Reyes approached cautiously, his voice low. Lieutenant, maybe we should. Enough, Harris barked, cutting him off. He turned back to Olivia, his patience clearly fraying. Dr. Langston, either you come with us voluntarily, or we'll have to escalate this. Olivia's chest tightened. She knew how quickly situations like this could spiral out of control, and she wasn't about to give them the satisfaction of seeing her rattled. But she also knew the power of witnesses, of making sure the truth had a chance to be seen, even if it came at her own expense. I'll come with you, she said finally, her voice steady. But understand this, Lieutenant. Every word you say, every action you take is being watched, and not just by the people in that diner. Harris's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. He simply gestured toward the patrol car. As Olivia walked to the car, she felt the weight of dozens of eyes on her, some sympathetic, others judgmental, and a few merely curious. Evelyn Grayson stood just inside the diner, her expression unreadable. Whether she was an ally or merely an observer remained to be seen. Reyes opened the car door for Olivia, his movements hesitant. I'm sorry about this, he murmured as she stepped inside. Olivia didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. The station was cold and sterile, the fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows on the pale walls. Olivia sat in a small, windowless room, her hands folded neatly on the table in front of her. She refused to let the indignity of the situation sink in. Instead, she focused on the facts, on the steps she would take next. After what felt like an eternity, the door opened, and Harris entered, followed by a man in a dark suit. The newcomer's sharp features and expensive watch screamed legal counsel. Dr. Langston, the man said, his tone almost affable. I'm Assistant District Attorney Mitchell. I understand there's been some confusion. Olivia's eyes narrowed. Confusion, she repeated, her tone flat. That's one way to describe it. Mitchell sat across from her, his posture relaxed, but his eyes keen. I've reviewed the preliminary reports, and while the situation is complicated, I'd like to assure you that this is all a matter of due diligence. Due diligence, Olivia said, her voice laced with irony. Let me save you some time. I raised my voice to defend a young woman being harassed. That's not a crime. Perhaps not, Mitchell conceded, leaning forward slightly. But we have to consider the optics. Witnesses described the interaction as heated and when tensions run high. Don't, Olivia interrupted, her voice firm. Don't tell me this is about optics. This is about perception, and we both know what that means. Mitchell hesitated, his confidence faltering. Harris shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing. This isn't about what I did, Olivia continued, her gaze unwavering. It's about who I am, a black woman in a position of power, daring to speak up in a space where people like me are expected to stay silent. Mitchell exhaled, his composure slipping just slightly. Dr. Langston, I'm not here to debate societal issues. I'm here to ensure this matter is resolved quickly and quietly. And I'm here to ensure it's resolved justly, Olivia shot back. So tell me, ADA Mitchell, how do you plan to make that happen? The room fell silent for a moment, the tension thick enough to cut. Finally, Mitchell straightened, his professional mask slipping back into place. "We're releasing you without charge, effective immediately," he said. "But I strongly advise you to avoid further incidents." Olivia's lips curled into a faint smile, though her eyes remained cold. "Thank you for your advice, Mr. Mitchell. I'll be sure to consider it." Harris opened his mouth as if to protest, but Mitchell silenced him with a glance. "This matter is closed," the ADA said firmly. As Olivia rose from her chair, her movements deliberate and controlled, she felt the weight of the moment settle around her. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Outside the station, a small crowd had gathered, journalists, onlookers, and a handful of allies, including Marlene and Evelyn Grayson. Olivia stepped into the cool evening air, her composure unbroken despite the day's events. Evelyn approached, her expression unreadable. "Dr. Langston," she said quietly, "I'd like to talk. In private." Olivia studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Lead the way." As they walked toward Evelyn's waiting car, Olivia felt the weight of the day begin to shift. She wasn't done fighting, not by a long shot. But this time, she wouldn't be fighting alone. The echo of the police station's door shutting behind Dr. Olivia Langston was almost deafening. Outside, the crowd had thickened. A smattering of journalists held cameras aloft, snapping shots of Olivia as she descended the steps. Marlene was standing to the side, arms crossed, her expression a blend of defiance and worry. Evelyn Grayson was further back, watching the scene with a calculated gaze. Olivia stopped at the bottom step, taking a deep breath to steady herself. The humiliation of the day still simmered beneath her skin, but she pushed it aside. She had work to do. She wasn't going to let a corrupt system write this narrative for her. "Dr. Langston, a moment?" A journalist with a microphone extended stepped forward, her voice cutting through the murmurs. "Do you believe this incident was racially motivated?" Olivia met the journalist's gaze. "I believe this incident is indicative of a broader systemic issue," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I spoke out against harassment and was targeted for doing so. That's not just about race. That's about power dynamics and accountability. And I will not be silenced." The murmurs rose as cameras clicked faster. Olivia turned to Marlene, who approached with a protective stance. "You okay, sweetheart?" Marlene asked, her voice low. "I will be," Olivia said, her tone resolute. "But this isn't over." Evelyn appeared at Olivia's side, her presence as composed as ever. "Dr. Langston," she said smoothly, her voice pitched low enough to keep the conversation private. "We need to talk." Olivia gave her a measured look. "And why is that, Miss Grayson?" "Because what happened in there wasn't just an unfortunate misunderstanding," Evelyn replied. "It was a power play, and you're not the only one they're trying to silence." Olivia's eyes narrowed. "Go on." Evelyn's lips pressed into a thin line. "Not here. Let's go somewhere more private." Inside Evelyn's luxury sedan, the tension was thick. The car glided smoothly through the city streets, the hum of the engine the only sound for several moments. Evelyn glanced at Olivia, her face illuminated by the glow of passing streetlights. "I've seen this before," Evelyn began. "Powerful institutions trying to undermine those who challenge the status quo. But this isn't just about you, Dr. Langston. It's bigger than that." Olivia tilted her head, studying Evelyn carefully. "You seem to know a lot about what's happening." "I do," Evelyn admitted. "Reardon, he's not just a belligerent executive. He's connected to the Brighton Falls Chamber of Commerce. They've been quietly opposing initiatives like yours for years. Programs that level the playing field for underfunded clinics and underserved communities. What you experienced today wasn't random. It was intentional." Olivia's jaw tightened. She had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed stoked the fire within her. "And you've known this?" Evelyn's gaze didn't waver. "I suspected it. Today proved it. Reardon's complaint wasn't about an altercation. It was about sending a message. To silence me," Olivia said, the realization sharp and bitter. "To silence anyone who disrupts their carefully curated ecosystem," Evelyn said. "But they don't know who they're dealing with." Olivia leaned back, considering her options. She could walk away, let the noise die down, and focus on her projects quietly. Or she could fight, not just for herself, but for the countless others who had been silenced before her. "And what about you?" Olivia asked. Where do you stand in all of this? Evelyn's lips twitched in a faint smile. I stand where progress stands, Dr. Langston. And right now, progress is sitting in this car. Olivia allowed herself a small smile, but her mind was already racing. If I'm going to fight this, I need more than words. I need proof. Evelyn's smile widened. That's the first smart thing you've said all day. The next morning, Olivia sat in her office at Langston Medical Innovations, the city skyline stretching out before her. The weight of the previous day lingered, but her resolve had hardened. Her assistant, Daniel, entered with a stack of reports and a nervous expression. "Good morning, Dr. Langston," he said, setting the papers on her desk. I heard about what happened yesterday." "News travels fast," Olivia said, her tone wry. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice hesitant but genuine. "I'm fine," she said, "but we have work to do." Daniel nodded, straightening slightly. "What do you need?" "I need everything we have on the Brighton Falls Chamber of Commerce," Olivia said. "Connections, funding sources, policy stances. Anything that ties them to yesterday's incident." Daniel hesitated. "That might be tricky. They're well insulated." "I know," Olivia said, "but tricky isn't impossible. Start with their public records and work backward. I'll handle the rest." As Daniel left, Olivia opened her laptop, her fingers flying across the keyboard. She was done playing defense. It was time to take the fight to them. By midday, Olivia had pieced together a clearer picture. The Chamber of Commerce wasn't just opposing her initiatives. They were actively lobbying against policies that supported equitable healthcare access. Reardon's name appeared repeatedly in board meeting minutes, often tied to discussions about protecting business interests. Olivia's phone buzzed, breaking her focus. It was Evelyn. "I have something for you," Evelyn said without preamble. "Meet me at the Loft." "The Loft?" Olivia repeated, frowning. It was one of Brighton Falls' most exclusive clubs, a place where deals were made behind closed doors. "You'll want to see this," Evelyn said, her tone serious. "Trust me." The Loft was as opulent as Olivia had imagined, with dark wood paneling, leather armchairs, and the faint scent of expensive cigars. Evelyn met her at the entrance, leading her to a private room in the back. On the table was a sleek laptop, its screen glowing with an open file. "What is this?" Olivia asked, leaning in. "Minutes from a closed-door meeting at the Chamber of Commerce," Evelyn said. Reardon and several others discussing ways to discredit community leaders who challenged their agenda. Olivia scrolled through the document, her stomach churning as she read phrases like containment strategy and media narratives. The implications were damning. "How did you get this?" Olivia asked, her voice low. "Let's just say I have friends in high places," Evelyn replied, her smile thin. "The question is, what do you plan to do with it?" Olivia straightened, the fire in her eyes unmistakable. "I'm going to expose them." Evelyn's expression shifted, a flicker of doubt crossing her face. "Be careful, Dr. Langston. These people don't play fair." "Neither do I," Olivia said. The lights in the chamber were harsh, casting stark shadows against the faces seated around the gleaming mahogany table. It was the monthly Brighton Falls Chamber of Commerce meeting, an exclusive gathering of the city's most influential figures. At the head of the table sat Michael Reardon, his usual air of self-importance amplified by the eager nods of his colleagues. Dr. Olivia Langston stood at the room's threshold, the heavy oak doors framing her presence like the opening scene of a battle. She was impeccably dressed, her tailored black suit a silent declaration of war. In her hands was a slim leather folio containing the weapon she needed, proof of the chamber's corruption, collusion, and systematic attempts to sabotage community progress. Reardon's expression shifted from surprise to irritation as she stepped into the room. "Dr. Langston," he said, his voice thick with feigned politeness. "To what do we owe the pleasure?" Olivia's heels clicked against the marble floor as she strode toward the table. She didn't wait for an invitation to speak. "I believe it's time we had a conversation, Mr. Reardon. One that's long overdue." The murmurs around the table grew louder. A few members exchanged nervous glances, their eyes darting between Olivia and Reardon. Evelyn Grayson was among them, though her expression remained neutral, a calculated mask. She had facilitated Olivia's entry to this meeting, but her allegiance remained unclear. Reardon leaned back in his chair, his smirk cutting through the tension like a knife. I'm afraid you'll have to be more specific. I don't recall scheduling a meeting with you. That's because you didn't, Olivia said sharply, dropping the folio onto the table. The sound echoed in the room, silencing the murmurs. But your actions have forced this meeting into existence. Reardon's smirk faltered as Olivia opened the folio, revealing printed copies of the chamber's internal communications. She spread the documents across the table like a dealer revealing a winning hand. Emails, minutes from closed-door meetings, evidence of your coordinated efforts to discredit not just me, but anyone advocating for equitable change in Brighton Falls. The room went still, save for the rustling of paper as a few members tentatively picked up the documents. Olivia's voice remained steady, each word slicing through the silence like a blade. The Brighton Falls Chamber of Commerce has been masquerading as a force for good, while actively working to suppress initiatives that threaten your narrow interests. Yesterday's incident was not an accident. It was a calculated attempt to undermine my credibility and silence my voice. Reardon's face reddened, his polished veneer cracking. This is outrageous, he snapped, his composure slipping. You have no right to barge in here and accuse us. No right, Olivia interrupted, her voice rising. I have every right, as a citizen, as a leader, and as someone who refuses to be silenced by men like you. A ripple of unease passed through the room. Evelyn leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as she addressed Reardon. Michael, perhaps you'd like to explain these documents. Some of them bear your signature. Reardon shot her a venomous look. Don't be ridiculous, Evelyn. This is clearly a smear campaign orchestrated by someone who can't handle rejection. Olivia's lips curled into a bitter smile. You think this is about rejection? Let me be clear. This is about accountability. You've spent years hiding behind your power, manipulating systems to benefit yourself and those like you. But today, that ends. Reardon slammed his hand on the table, the sound reverberating in the tense room. Enough of this nonsense. You have no proof that these documents are legitimate. That's where you're wrong, Olivia said, pulling a thumb drive from her pocket and holding it up. Every document in this folder has been verified, and copies are already with my legal team, local journalists, and city officials. The color drained from Reardon's face. He turned to the other members of the chamber, his voice desperate. You can't seriously believe her. This is an attack on all of us, a threat to everything we've built. A few members shifted uncomfortably, their loyalty to Reardon wavering under the weight of Olivia's evidence. Evelyn remained silent, her gaze fixed on Reardon with quiet intensity. Olivia seized the moment. This isn't an attack on you, she said, addressing the room. It's a challenge to do better, to be better. The people of Brighton Falls deserve leaders who serve them, not exploit them. The question is, will you rise to that challenge? Or will you cling to a system that's destined to crumble? The silence that followed was deafening. For a moment, Olivia thought the tension might shatter the room. Then, Evelyn spoke. Dr. Langston is right, she said, her voice measured but firm. We cannot continue to operate in secrecy and expect to maintain the trust of this community. Change is inevitable and necessary. Reardon stared at her, betrayal etched across his face. You can't be serious. I am, Evelyn said, her tone unwavering. And if you were wise, Michael, you'd stop digging your own grave. Reardon's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. The tide had shifted, and he knew it. Olivia stepped back from the table, her shoulders squared. I've said my piece. What happens next is up to you. But know this, I won't stop fighting for what's right. Not here, not anywhere. With that, she turned and walked toward the door, the weight of the moment settling around her. The stakes had been laid bare, and the battle was far from over. But for the first time in days, Olivia felt a glimmer of hope, a sense that the tide was turning in her favor. As she stepped into the hallway, Evelyn followed, her heels clicking against the polished floor. You've made quite an impression, she said, her tone almost admiring. It's not about impressions, Olivia replied. It's about action. Evelyn nodded, a faint smile tugging at her lips. Then let's get to work. The sun dipped below the Brighton Falls skyline as Dr. Olivia Langston arrived at City Hall, the towering building casting long shadows across the bustling square. Tonight, the Chamber's board members were hosting a public forum, a rare event meant to address community concerns. The timing was too perfect to be coincidental. Olivia knew they'd spin it as a gesture of goodwill while continuing their clandestine dealings behind closed doors. Olivia adjusted her tailored blazer, the thumb drive containing damning evidence tucked safely in her pocket. Her steps echoed against the marble floors as she entered the grand hall, its cavernous space filled with rows of folding chairs and a raised stage at the front. The crowd was already gathering, a mix of community members, local officials, and reporters armed with notebooks and cameras. Among them, Olivia spotted familiar faces. Marlene stood near the back, arms crossed, her expression stern. Evelyn Grayson sat in the audience, her calculating gaze locked on the stage. And there, standing confidently in the center of the stage, was Michael Reardon. He was surrounded by other chamber members, their expressions carefully neutral. Reardon's suit was immaculate, his smile rehearsed to perfection as he greeted attendees and exchanged pleasantries. But Olivia could see through the facade. His charm was a mask for desperation. He knew she was coming. As the clock struck 7, Reardon stepped to the podium, his voice carrying through the room with practiced ease. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight for this important discussion about our city's future. The Brighton Falls Chamber of Commerce remains committed to fostering growth and opportunity for all. Olivia tuned out the platitudes, her mind racing as she mentally rehearsed her plan. She had no intention of waiting for the Q&A session. Tonight, she was taking control of the narrative. Reardon's speech droned on, but Olivia's sharp ears caught the faintest shift in tone when he said, "Unfortunately, in today's polarized climate, we've seen individuals use misinformation to undermine the progress we've worked so hard to achieve." The subtle jab was unmistakable, and Olivia's fists clenched at her sides. It was a challenge, a warning wrapped in condescension. She smiled faintly. If Reardon wanted a fight, he'd chosen the wrong opponent. The moment Reardon concluded his speech, Olivia stood, her movements deliberate as she strode down the aisle. The murmur of the crowd grew louder as heads turned, the sight of her commanding immediate attention. She reached the edge of the stage, her voice cutting through the room like a blade. "Excuse me, Mr. Reardon," she said. "I have a question." Reardon's smile faltered, but he recovered quickly, his tone oozing mock politeness. "Dr. Langston, how unexpected. Of course, we'd be happy to address your concerns during the Q&A. "Oh, this isn't a concern," Olivia replied, stepping onto the stage. Her heels clicked against the wood as she turned to face the crowd. "It's a revelation." The room fell silent, the tension palpable. Reardon's colleagues shifted uneasily, their carefully curated expressions betraying flickers of unease. Evelyn leaned forward in her seat, her eyes narrowing with interest. "I've spent the past 24 hours reviewing the Chamber's recent actions," Olivia began, her voice steady and commanding. "And what I've found is deeply troubling." She reached in her pocket, pulling out the thumb drive and holding it aloft. This contains documents, emails, and meeting minutes that reveal a coordinated effort by the Chamber of Commerce to suppress initiatives aimed at equity and inclusion in Brighton Falls. Not only have you lobbied against policies designed to support underserved communities, but you've also actively discredited leaders who advocate for change. Gasps rippled through the audience, and the click of cameras punctuated the stunned silence. Reardon's mask of composure cracked. "That's a serious accusation, Dr. Langston," he said, his voice tight. "And I hope you have evidence to back it up." "I do," Olivia said, plugging the drive into the podium's computer. The screen behind her flickered to life, displaying a series of damning emails and excerpts from meeting minutes. The audience leaned forward, their eyes glued to the screen as Olivia highlighted key phrases: containment strategy, media manipulation, discredit community leaders. Reardon's face reddened, his usual smooth demeanor unraveling. "This is a gross misrepresentation," he sputtered. "These documents lack context." "They speak for themselves," Olivia interrupted, her voice sharp. "And the context is clear. You've prioritized profits over people, power over progress. You've used your influence to silence voices like mine because we threaten your grip on this city. The room erupted into chaos. Reporters shouted questions, community members voiced their outrage, and the chamber members huddled together, their whispers frantic. Evelyn sat back, a small, satisfied smile playing on her lips. Reardon slammed his hand on the podium, his voice booming over the commotion. Enough! This is nothing but a smear campaign by someone who can't accept that her ideas are flawed. Olivia stepped closer to him, her gaze piercing. Flawed ideas? You mean equitable healthcare access, community investment, and dismantling systemic barriers? Tell me, Mr. Reardon, which of those do you find so threatening? Reardon opened his mouth, but no words came. The crowd was no longer on his side. The tide had turned, and he knew it. One of the chamber members, a middle-aged woman with a pinched expression, stepped forward, her voice trembling. Michael, is this true? Reardon glared at her, his desperation palpable. Don't be naive. This is an attack on all of us. No, Olivia said, her voice rising above the chaos. This is accountability. The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers echoing through the hall. Reardon's colleagues began to splinter, some voicing their support for Olivia, others distancing themselves from the exposed corruption. As the noise reached a fever pitch, Reardon leaned closer to Olivia, his voice a venomous whisper. You think you've won? This city isn't ready for someone like you. Olivia met his glare with unwavering resolve. This city deserves someone like me. She turned back to the audience, her voice carrying through the room with undeniable power. Brighton Falls has been held hostage by corruption and greed for too long. But tonight marks the beginning of a new chapter, one where transparency, justice, and equity take precedence. The applause swelled, and Olivia stood tall, the weight of the moment settling over her. She had faced the storm and emerged stronger, but she knew the battle wasn't over. The real fight was just beginning. As she stepped off the stage, Evelyn joined her, a rare look of admiration in her eyes. Well played, she said. But be careful. Reardon won't go down without a fight. Neither will I, Olivia replied. The two women exchanged a knowing look before disappearing into the crowd, leaving the fallout to unfold behind them. The aftermath of the forum was nothing short of a media storm. By the time Dr. Olivia Langston returned home that night, the story had already made headlines. Chamber of Commerce corruption exposed by prominent activist. The footage of Olivia's calm, yet scathing takedown of Michael Reardon and his allies was circulating online, gaining traction as people across Brighton Falls and beyond voiced their outrage. In the days that followed, the Chamber of Commerce faced intense scrutiny. Several board members resigned, distancing themselves from Reardon, whose public reputation was in shambles. Investigations into the Chamber's activities revealed years of financial impropriety and lobbying efforts designed to undermine progressive policies. Local officials who had turned a blind eye to the Chamber's actions scrambled to save face, pledging to launch oversight committees and transparency initiatives. Reardon himself disappeared from public view, his absence only fueling speculation about his future. For Olivia, it was a victory, but one that came with its own set of challenges. Protagonist growth. Olivia stood in her office, watching the city skyline through her floor-to-ceiling windows. The past week had been a whirlwind of interviews, meetings, and planning sessions. Her name had become synonymous with accountability and justice, but the weight of that responsibility was not lost on her. Daniel, her assistant, entered with a tablet in hand. Dr. Langston, Channel 8 wants a live interview tomorrow about the reforms being proposed. And there's a request from the mayor's office for a roundtable discussion next week. Olivia turned to face him, her expression contemplative. Schedule the interview, but push the roundtable. I want to be sure we're prepared with actionable solutions before we sit down with city leaders. Daniel nodded, a small smile on his face. You know you could take a day off? You've earned it. Olivia smiled faintly, but her eyes remained serious. There's no time for rest, Daniel. This fight is bigger than me. He hesitated, then said softly, it's also because of you. People are paying attention now because you didn't back down. That means something. His words lingered after he left the room. Olivia knew she had changed over the course of this battle. She had always been driven, but the events of the past weeks had taught her the importance of resilience, not just for herself, but for the countless people who looked to her as a symbol of hope. Her actions had sparked something larger, and she was determined to see it through. Systemic change. A week later, Olivia stood on the steps of City Hall, flanked by community leaders, activists, and even a few reformed members of the Chamber of Commerce. The crowd before her was diverse and energized, holding signs that read "Justice for Brighton Falls" and "Equity Now." Evelyn Grayson stood nearby, her expression unreadable, but her presence unmistakably supportive. While their alliance was still new and tentative, Evelyn's influence had been instrumental in dismantling the Chamber's corrupt network from within. Olivia stepped up to the microphone, her voice carrying over the crowd with unwavering conviction. This is not the end of a battle. It's the beginning of a movement. For too long, Brighton Falls has been held back by greed and inequality. But today, we take a step toward a brighter future. Together, we will build a city that uplifts every voice, values every life, and ensures that opportunity is not a privilege, but a right. The applause was deafening, the energy electric. As Olivia looked out at the sea of faces, she saw the ripple effect of her actions. A community galvanized to demand better, not just for themselves, but for future generations. Emotional closure. That evening, Olivia returned to the diner where it all began. The familiar hum of conversation and clatter of dishes was a comforting contrast to the chaos of her public life. Marlene greeted her with a warm smile, sliding a cup of coffee onto the counter before Olivia even asked. "You look like you've been through a war, sweetheart," Marlene said, leaning on the counter. "But I'd say you won." Olivia chuckled softly. "It doesn't feel like a win yet. There's still so much to do." "There always will be," Marlene said. "But that doesn't mean you can't celebrate the small victories." Olivia nodded, taking a sip of her coffee. The bitterness was grounding, a reminder that even in triumph, the work was far from over. But there was a quiet satisfaction in knowing she had made a difference, however small. As she sat there, the doorbell jingled, and a young woman entered, hesitating for a moment before approaching Olivia. "Dr. Langston?" the woman said nervously. "I just wanted to say thank you for everything you've done. People like me finally feel like we have a voice because of you." Olivia smiled, her heart swelling with a mixture of pride and humility. "Thank you," she said. "But remember, this isn't just about me. Change happens when we all stand together." The woman nodded, her eyes bright with determination. "We will," setting up future possibilities. Later that night, Olivia sat at her desk, reviewing a proposal from a coalition of cities interested in replicating Brighton Falls reforms. The scope of the work ahead was daunting, but it was also invigorating. The fight for justice and equity was far from over, and Olivia was ready to lead the charge. Her phone buzzed with a message from Evelyn. "We need to talk. There's more you should know." Olivia's brow furrowed as she read the text. The victory in Brighton Falls had been hard-won, but Evelyn's cryptic message hinted at battles yet to come. Olivia exhaled, her resolve hardening once more. "Let's see what's next," she murmured to herself, closing the proposal and reaching for her phone. The road ahead was uncertain, but Olivia Langston had proven she could weather any storm. Whatever came next, she would face it head-on, armed with the lessons of her journey and the unwavering belief that change was possible. Dr. Olivia Langston leaned against the window of her office, the city stretching out before her in an array of lights and shadows. The events of the past weeks played in her mind like a reel. The confrontation with Michael Reardon, the exposure of systemic corruption, and the tidal wave of reform that had begun to ripple through Brighton Falls. She had entered the battle expecting resistance, but the depth of the opposition and the strength of the community's response had exceeded even her expectations. For Olivia, the journey had been as personal as it was political. It wasn't just about standing up to Reardon or dismantling the Chamber's corrupt influence. It was about proving to herself and others that change was possible. She had faced humiliation, fear, and doubt, But she had also discovered reservoirs of resilience she hadn't known she possessed. She had learned to trust her instincts, rely on her allies, and push forward even when the odds seemed insurmountable. As she watched the city lights flicker, Olivia knew she was not the same woman who had walked into Marlene's diner weeks ago. She had always been strong, but now her strength carried a sharper edge, tempered by the fires of adversity. The battle had changed her, hardened her resolve, sharpened her focus, and deepened her understanding of the world she sought to improve. Connecting personal struggle to systemic issues. The events in Brighton Falls had laid bare the stark realities of systemic corruption and inequality. Olivia's confrontation with Reardon was not just a clash of personalities. It was a microcosm of the broader struggles faced by marginalized communities everywhere. The Chamber of Commerce, with its web of influence and unchecked power, symbolized the forces that perpetuate inequality under the guise of progress. Their actions were not isolated. They were emblematic of a system that prioritized profit and privilege over justice and equity. Yet, amidst the darkness, there had been moments of light. The community's response, their willingness to rally behind Olivia and demand change, was a testament to the power of collective action. Ordinary citizens, long silenced by fear or apathy, found their voices and stood together. Local leaders who had once been complicit began to question their roles, spurred by the undeniable evidence Olivia had brought to light. Even Evelyn Grayson, a woman whose loyalties were as enigmatic as her sharp wit, had chosen to stand on the side of progress. This was the paradox Olivia had come to understand. Change was both painfully slow and remarkably swift. It required years of groundwork, of tireless advocacy and education, but it could also erupt in a single transformative moment when the right conditions aligned. The battle against systemic injustice was a marathon, but every step forward mattered. Inspiration for the audience. Olivia's story resonated far beyond Brighton Falls because it spoke to a universal truth. The fight for justice is never easy, but it is always necessary. Her journey was a reminder that progress is not the result of extraordinary individuals acting alone, but of ordinary people coming together to demand better. It was a call to action for anyone who had ever felt powerless in the face of injustice. A reminder that even the smallest acts of courage could spark a movement. The lessons were clear. Systems of power do not change on their own. They must be challenged, exposed, and reimagined. The work is often thankless, the victories incremental, but the alternative, silence, complicity, is far worse. Olivia's story showed that while the road to justice is steep and fraught with obstacles, it is also lined with allies, with moments of triumph, and with the promise of a better future. For those watching from the sidelines, Olivia's message was simple. Step forward. Use your voice, your platform, your resources to push for change. No action is too small, no effort wasted. The fight belongs to everyone. Emotional impact and moving forward. As Olivia prepared to leave her office, her phone buzzed with a message. It was from Evelyn Grayson, succinct as always. Reardon's resignation will be announced tomorrow. They're trying to minimize the fallout, but he's finished. Olivia stared at the screen for a moment, a bittersweet smile tugging at her lips. Reardon's fall from grace was a victory, but it wasn't the end. The chamber would need to be rebuilt, its policies overhauled, and its leadership redefined. The road ahead was long, but this was a milestone worth celebrating. She slipped her phone into her bag and headed for the elevator. As the doors closed, she allowed herself a moment of reflection. The past few weeks had tested her in ways she hadn't anticipated, but they had also reaffirmed her purpose. She had faced the worst of what the system could throw at her and emerged stronger. More importantly, she had inspired others to believe in the possibility of change. Outside, the air was cool and crisp. A small group of supporters had gathered near the building, holding signs of gratitude and encouragement. Olivia approached them, her heart swelling at their warmth. "Thank you for everything you've done," one woman said, her voice filled with emotion. "You've given us hope." Olivia nodded, her voice steady. "Hope is just the beginning. Now we turn it into action." As she walked away, her mind was already racing with plans for the future. There was so much left to do, coalitions to build, policies to draft, communities to uplift. The fight for justice was far from over, but Olivia Langston was ready. She had faced the storm and found her strength. And now, she was determined to lead others through it. Final reflection. Dr. Olivia Langston's journey was a story of resilience, of standing firm in the face of overwhelming odds and finding strength in vulnerability. It was a story about the power of community, the necessity of accountability, and the enduring hope that change is possible. Her fight was not just her own. It was a reflection of countless others who had struggled before her and alongside her. And while her story came to a close, the ripple effects of her actions continued to spread, inspiring new battles, new victories, and new stories yet to be written. As the lights of Brighton Falls twinkled in the distance, one thing was clear. The fight for justice was a long one, but it was a fight worth waging. And with leaders like Olivia at the helm, the future looked brighter than ever.